a worldwide problem needing massive government intervention across many countries to avoid catastrophe. If you've been following climate change, the coronavirus pandemic will feel oddly familiar these days. Countries, including the U.S., have implemented radical policies that would have been unthinkable a few weeks ago to slow the spread of the virus. Is this what it will take to solve the climate crisis? Today, we'll talk to a writer who sees in the coronavirus pandemic the outlines of the coming climate crisis. That's coming up in a minute.
Hi, I'm Nate Cubis.
And I'm Reggie Cubis.
We're the sons of Trump on Earth producer Andy Cubis.
She works behind the scenes.
We think you should support this podcast on how do you say this word? Patreon. Because the environment matters for us kids.
Go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth to learn more.
You can pledge as little as $1 a month.
We can even afford that with our measly allowance, right, Nate?
Right. Thank you.
Climate change and coronavirus. My guest today says they can't be separated, and she's driving that home in her writing and a new podcast about the intersection of the two topics. Emily Atkin is a climate reporter and writer. She's a former writer and editor at The New Republic, and last year she launched the Heated newsletter. If you're listening to this podcast, I suspect you've already subscribed, but if you haven't, you can find it at heated.world. The newsletter is, in her words, for people who are pissed off about climate change. Emily Atkins now turned Heated into a podcast series about the intersection of climate change and coronavirus.
COVID-19 and the climate crisis cannot be separated. The Heated podcast is a 6-episode limited-run series. In this series, we connect the dots on how two of the most pressing issues of our time are really one and the same. In the podcast, I'll bring you up-to-the-minute interviews with climate experts like Mary Heglar, Anthony Rogers-Wright, Kate Aronoff, Aaron Bernstein, and, in our first episode, Bill McKibben.
The basic point that I've been trying to get across to people about the world is that reality is indeed real, that you can't negotiate with physics and chemistry, that you can't compromise with them or spin them away. Coronavirus is teaching us precisely this lesson about biology as well. Reality is real, and sometimes it bites pretty hard.
The Heated podcast. Find us in the Drilled podcast feed, everywhere you get your podcasts.
Emily, welcome to Trump on Earth.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just talk about the new podcast that you're doing. Tell me about the podcast series and why you decided to do it.
I decided to do a podcast series because I was very confused about coronavirus. I sort of was sitting here watching this global crisis take over society and politics in our lives, and I think I was just as confused as everybody else on what I should be doing as a journalist and how I should be approaching it as a climate journalist, because I knew there were clear parallels. I mean, it's a problem that threatens millions of lives across the world. Scientists are telling us to act very rapidly and quickly, and yet we're not doing that. But I couldn't figure out where I should be focused on. So I wanted to talk to really smart people about that, and I figured if I was going to be doing that anyway, I might as well record it and make it available for other people to listen to so that we could all figure it out together. I mean, this is an unprecedented time. I always wanted to make a podcast out of the newsletter. I wasn't thinking it was going to be this, but this is what happened.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover here. So let's just talk about coronavirus. I've been thinking about this in preparing for this interview. I mean, just in general, it's hard not to think about it if you've followed climate change. You know, this is a massive problem that requires collective action on an unprecedented scale. And there's a lot of resistance, built-in resistance to changing our behaviors and our systems. Let's kind of unpack that a little bit. How do you view how these problems are similar, and do you see there being big differences in how these problems manifest themselves or how they need to be looked at?
Well, of course, I think the differences are good to get out of the way first. Coronavirus is obviously hugely different in that it is much faster and the impact to human life much more urgent. By the time the curve has been flattened, I think we're all going to have seen people close to us either financially affected or affected in their health. A lot of us are going to lose loved ones, and it's going to happen very fast. This is touching every aspect of our lives very obviously right now, whereas climate change is touching every aspect of our life right now, but it's a little less obvious day to day. And the people who are going to be really affected by it to this magnitude, if we don't do anything, will probably be less close to us or down the line. The other thing is that with coronavirus, we don't have as big of a industry whose whole livelihood depends on the crisis keeping going. The pharmaceutical industry will be fine, coronavirus or not. The fossil fuel industry will not be fine if we solve climate change, because there will be no fossil fuel industry. Those are the two big differences, I think. But the big similarities here are that climate change is a problem that won't be solved unless we take really radical action very quickly on a global scale. It can't be done without the biggest nations on earth. It can't be done without everybody. It's a problem where millions of lives are threatened, and it threatens not only lives but sort of society in general, how we live our lives. It's a problem where we have to listen to scientists. There's no compromises based on biology or physics. Carbon dioxide warms the atmosphere, and so if we want atmosphere to stop warming, we need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide, just the same as, coronavirus is a virus that attacks our cells, and that's why we need to stay away from each other. It's basic science and physics. There's some social similarities, a reluctance to sort of admit to the scale of the problem as we know it. I think we saw that in rapid fire with coronavirus, where we all kind of knew it was happening, but we were like, but it's not going to affect me, and I don't really have to do anything. And then sort of the build to realize oh, actually I do have to do something. It is going to affect me. That's sort of what we're seeing with climate change, but on a much slower scale. I mean, coronavirus to me is basically just climate change sped up 10 times over. It's like climate change on steroids.
Yeah, and there's also, you mentioned it, but there was this resistance to listening to what the scientists were telling us about. And I feel like with climate change, you can basically get away with that for years. I mean, that is the terrible thing about climate change, is that the ramifications for our actions or inaction won't be felt till the next generation, really. But, with coronavirus, I mean, there is a bit of a lag, but it's 3 weeks. If you don't deal with it in a month, people will be dying. With climate change, it'll be maybe in 15 years when your 3-year-old is going to college, the town they go to school in will get a hurricane or something. But
there's still plausible deniability too when it comes to climate change deaths that happen now, right? Someone you love could be really affected by a hurricane or a drought or a flooding event, but it's not like coronavirus, where if they die from coronavirus, they die from coronavirus. Whereas if you die because of the effects of climate change, which people are dying from the effects of climate change right now, you can sort of make an excuse in your brain that it wasn't that. I think that's an important distinction to make when we're talking about who is going to be affected by climate change. It's different because people are going to see the effects down the line. It's not that people are going to see the effects down the line, it's that people aren't going to start admitting to themselves that these are the effects until down the line. Climate change hasn't stopped because of coronavirus. We've all stopped. We've all focused our attention on this one thing, but climate change hasn't stopped. It's still happening. Our efforts to combat it have just slowed, and the fossil fuel industry's efforts to take advantage of the crisis and make sure they can survive when this is done have gotten faster. So these are all just things that we need to keep in mind as we're self-isolating and trying to deal with this crisis. It's not that we've replaced one crisis for the other, it's that now we have two to deal with at once.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good transition here. There's been effort from environmental groups and some in the Democratic Party coalition to infuse any recovery package with sort of green policies, almost to use this time to kickstart a Green New Deal. What have you made of the debate about whether or not any recovery package should incentivize decarbonization or, ramp up renewables or things like that?
It doesn't seem unrelated to me, and maybe that's just because I've been a climate change reporter for so long. I see a lot of the argument that trying to put efforts that emphasize renewables into a COVID relief bill, it's unrelated. But for me, when I look at it, I'm like, well, those are the jobs that we needed to create anyway, and we're dealing with mass unemployment. And if we're going to put $2 trillion in revitalizing the economy, why not create an economy that is more resilient to global threats, especially as we're facing a global threat? So efforts to put green jobs. Also, if we had the opportunity to spend trillions of dollars revitalizing the economy and in the process could not only save millions of lives from coronavirus, but could save millions of lives from climate change, creating a better society that's more sustainable, why wouldn't we do that? I don't understand why there seems to be so much obsession with just dealing with coronavirus so we can go back to the place we were before coronavirus, when obviously the place we were before coronavirus wasn't great, because look at where we are right now. I feel like there needs to be creative thinking on how we address problems through economic relief.
I listened to your latest podcast with Kate Aronoff.
We just don't have a society which is resilient, right? We don't have a society which can respond to big threats in the way that I think a lot of people sort of hoped we could. And why is that? Because the right wing has spent the last 40 or 50 years dismantling the idea that the public sector was worth investing in.
Kate Aronoff, mentioned some of she called them moderate solutions, but I don't think everyone in American politics will agree, especially in mainstream media and politics, on some way solutions that should come out of any kind of rebuild from the coronavirus, recession that we're currently about to fall into. Can you discuss maybe what you and Kate discussed and what some of the arguments for those would be?
Well, what Kate sees as a moderate solution is nationalizing the fossil fuel industry, which, obviously the fossil fuel industry here would not like, because if we made a state-owned fossil fuel industry, they would no longer get to make billions of dollars on fossil fuels. But what she points out correctly is that the oil industry right now is in absolute crisis. Right now you can buy a 77 pack of Natty Ice, which is a terrible beer. It's more expensive than a barrel of oil. Right now, like a barrel of oil is super cheap. It's less than $20, which might change by the time this podcast airs, but it's still going to be cheap, and the fossil fuel industry can't really make a profit unless the price of oil is like $50 a barrel-ish. And they're sort of facing this crisis because there's a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which have state-owned oil companies. They're getting killed during this coronavirus crisis. On Friday, they went to the White House and they basically asked for help from the administration and for help, honestly, from taxpayers. And the president was reportedly very receptive to that, which is understandable. So we're already in a place where we are propping up oil companies and helping them survive through subsidies, through the billions of dollars of subsidies that we already give them. We're about to probably give them more help to survive during this crisis. And we're getting basically nothing from them to ramp down production to help solve our next global crisis, which is climate change. If the industry is already basically in crisis, why not take this opportunity to make it completely state-owned, and then we can address everything with our own dollars? And so that's Kate's proposal. And that way we would, make sure that we're ramping down fossil fuel production and ramping up renewable production and in line with what climate scientists say we need to do to prevent millions of deaths, just like coronavirus, from climate change.
Yeah, it's sort of like, will this bailout or, stimulus package be more of like a brown New Deal than a green New Deal, I guess is one way to think about it.
If you don't put climate forward-thinking policies in the corona relief stimulus package, then it is anti-climate bill, then it is a bill that worsens climate change. If it does not help the next global crisis, then it makes the next global crisis worse. That's it.
Yeah. It seems like the last month has been such a shock for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, we're just not used to government telling us things that we can and can't do in this country in the way that they're doing it now, closing restaurants, telling people to stay home. All these things that a month ago would have been unthinkable. Spending $2 trillion on a financial aid package to keep the economy going. I mean, I wonder, do you see there being a shift in the way we see government or the things that become allowable because of this crisis? Do you think there would be some sort of carryover into the next phase of our politics where the big kind of climate actions that people like Bill McKibben and Kate Aronoff have been arguing for, and yourself have been arguing for years, will be more kind of acceptable in the political discourse? I mean, if we're straight up just giving Americans $1,200 to just survive, and giving industries hundreds of billions of dollars to survive, will a Green New Deal or something like it become more politically acceptable, I guess, in the mainstream discourse?
I mean, I think Americans in particular, our ability to forget things that have happened, what I would hope to come out of this situation in terms of changing our way of thinking is that we understand the difference between sacrifices you make while you still have time to prevent a problem and sacrifices you make when you are in the thick of a problem and you have no other choice. The very uncomfortable changes that we're going to have to make if we do reach a point where we're at 3 degrees Celsius, that's going to be worse than this right now, I promise. I mean, I've been covering climate change and covering climate science for long enough to know that if we reach 3 degrees Celsius, the world is going to look awful. And the things that we're going to have to do to try and reverse that in real time are not going to be pretty.
Yeah, I mean, I've been walking around Pittsburgh with a mask on. This word that keeps coming through my mind is like, when you do that, you're really, somebody my age, you're really trying to like look out for somebody my parents' age. Whenever I do it, I think I'm doing this for my parents and people my parents' age. And that is a sort of an act of solidarity and like mutual aid. Those are not the values that are routinely pushed on American consumers and voters. It's not as consonant as a term like freedom or something like that. But it seems like that level of sacrifice is what will be required to sort of forgo some things that are just, being able to drive wherever we want, whenever we want, and get an avocado at every time of year. Some of those things are just going to become a little bit out of reach, or maybe less common in a world where we really have to think about climate change as a number one issue.
That kind of shared sacrifice for people who are more vulnerable than us, that's the kind of stuff that historically has been seen as making us American, right? I think right now a lot of us see being American as this hyper individualist culture where you can make whatever world you want for yourself as long as you just care about yourself. And that's for some reason seen in some circles as the American way. But I think that what makes us truly American, what the American ideal is shared sacrifice for the common good. I mean, if you look back to World War II and the amount of shared sacrifice that society went through during the war to ensure that we were all right. I mean, we did food rationing. Every family in America did food rationing, and everyone understood that that was because we were going through a national crisis. And that's why I think it's seen as sort of un-American right now if you're not social distancing, if you're still going to a packed church with 100 people in it side by side. What are you doing? Like the most vulnerable people in society are probably at that church or interacting with people at that church. Like, you're putting people at risk. Don't do that. My hope is that we think of shared sacrifice in the same way for climate change, because our most vulnerable people aren't the elderly, they're the very young. Not only the very young, but they're also our most low-income citizens. They're also our indigenous citizens, and our farmers in the Midwest who aren't able to make livelihoods and grow food right now. I mean, why wouldn't we want to make sacrifices to help those people?
And there's also this issue of inequality, which people in the media are starting to kind of point out, that this crisis obviously I feel like I have to say obviously, but it's obviously going to impact people who are worse off in our society more. You know, if me and my kids and my wife have to ball up for 6 months, I mean, it'll suck, but it'll be doable. You know, if you're crowding into an apartment somewhere, it's harder. And, you know, we have health insurance. A lot of people don't. You know, these pre-existing conditions almost in our society will make this crisis worse for some people more than others. And I think, you know, you've really pointed this out in your work. That's the same thing in climate change.
I think about climate change all the time. It's very important to me, obviously, because I'm a climate change journalist. But as I've reported on it more and more years gone by, I realize that being who I am, middle-class white lady, living in D.C., if I'm in a crisis, I'm going to be fine. It's the same thing for climate change. I'm pretty sure that once climate change starts to really hit the fan, I'm going to be fine. Does that mean that I don't spend every day trying to figure out how to save people from climate change? No. It is, in my opinion, the American way to think about vulnerable people and how you help vulnerable people. And if you're in a position of privilege, especially during a crisis, then it's actually even more of your duty to do that. You know, I understand that we're all going through it right now, and we shouldn't be telling people to work if they don't have to work, because this is a traumatic experience. But there are also people who need to work, who are suffering. It is sort of my position here that if you have the privilege to do something with your time that helps other people, not helps yourself. I don't care if you like reorganize your spice rack, but try to help somebody else that doesn't have that privilege. That's all.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that we always see in these situations is people really do want to help other people. The food bank in Pittsburgh, there was this horrifying picture of this photographer at the local newspaper took drone footage of the line of cars for a food bank in one of the outlying communities here. And it was like hundreds of cars and just horrifying. But, you know, people flooded the food bank with donations. And, you know, I think people want to help other people. And these situations always bring out that aspect of our shared humanity. One thing I like to talk to people about who cover this issue is one big aspect of covering climate change is how you talk about it, and kind of the traditional view of journalism striving for objectivity and sort of not being an activist. You, in your work, you've done an interesting thing where you are still reporting, you're still uncovering truth about this issue, but I think you've done away with some of the, maybe in your mind, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, unnecessary constraints of, you know, never having an opinion about the thing that you're covering. I want to ask you how you see that issue of objectivity when it comes to something like climate change.
Yeah, I love this question.
Good.
No, it's one of my favorite questions to answer, because I don't pretend to not have an opinion on things. I used to really strive for objectivity. I actually have a piece in Columbia Journalism Review published last month sort of about this very question, about how I came from being a journalist who literally I would never tell you my opinion on anything, and I would try to be as down the middle, unbiased as possible, to where I am right now and sort of how I got there. It's called Good Grief. You can look it up. There's a really stupid illustration of me. I mean, it's wonderful, but it makes me look like female Guy Fieri, which is really great. My position on this is that you cannot be unbiased when it comes to a crisis that is going to kill millions of people if we don't do something. You wouldn't expect a journalist to be unbiased about the coronavirus, right? You wouldn't expect them to say like, well, we could just, you know, kill millions of people or not kill millions of people. It's not really my job as a journalist to tell you whether we should or shouldn't. Like, I personally want my journalists to be objective about what the solutions could be, and I try and do that myself. But, like, at least come from a place where you value human life, where you're just like, shouldn't we prevent people from dying? If you're trying to be both sidesy about climate change, one side is people die, one side is people don't die. And it's the same with the opioid crisis, right? Or do you expect your journalists to, when they're covering the opioid crisis, not come from a place where they want to prevent a bunch of deaths from opioid overdose? No, you want journalists who want people to not die. And I just want the same thing from climate journalists. I want recognition of this scientific fact that climate change is an existential threat to human life and society, and that if we don't do something about it, millions of people will die. That's it. That's your job. That's what they teach you in journalism school, is that your entire job as a journalist is to speak truth to power and protect the vulnerable from death and being taken advantage of and suffering. That's it.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, I should have asked you this in the beginning, but how is the quarantine going for you personally?
As long as I am working all the time, I feel okay. I definitely feel overworked, but every time I'm not working, I start to feel like full of anxiety. I mean, I'm not by myself all the time. I'm actually in my DC apartment with my older brother, who moved here right before the crisis started. So that's been weird because he and I really haven't spent that much time together as adults, but now we spend all of our time together. But as soon as I get like a day or two off and I realize I'm not doing anything, I start to get super anxiety ridden. I think that's probably everybody's experience here. How are you?
Okay. I mean, I feel like it's very hard to function as if everything were normal because it's obviously not. I feel overwhelmed by the enormity of what's going on. I try to do my thing that will make a contribution through my work here, but I also feel like, boy, it seems a little bit insignificant. So it's a weird time.
I think that, though, what I'm realizing is that my work also feels insignificant, compared to this global crisis. But through covering climate change and starting a newsletter, I realized that, like, my work doesn't have to be significant to everybody. It just has to be significant to some people, and it just has to help some people. And if it does that, then I can feel okay about it. Like when you're dealing with a global crisis like climate change, I think the same is true for coronavirus, it's impossible to have a really huge global impact. You're just one person. As long as you're doing something that has the potential to affect and help one or two other people, that's how you make change. It's how you feel better. I was talking to Bill McKibben about this on episode 1 of the podcast, about how Greta Thunberg, the climate activist, the only reason she started doing climate activism was because, she had anxiety about climate change and she felt like crap. She was going through crisis at home, like mental crisis. And the moment she just started doing her school strikes, it vastly improved her mental health. It was just a small act that just helped her feel a little bit better. And then in turn, it helped other people feel better too. So that's kind of the philosophy that I'm going forward with, that as long as I'm trying to do something, even if it doesn't work. I mean, Greta hasn't solved climate change yet. She's doing a lot, obviously, but even if it doesn't work, it still makes you feel better. That's good in and of itself.
Well, let me just venture to say that I think your work does matter, and I really appreciate you talking with us about it. Emily Atkin writes the Heated newsletter. You can find that at heated.world. You can also find links to her podcast, also called Heated, but that's also on the feed for the Drilled podcast. Emily Atkin, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thanks for having me, and I really appreciate your work too. And I just want to say that Pittsburgh is one of my favorite American cities. It's underrated.
Yeah, let's keep it that way.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I won't tell anybody.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org. That's where you'll find all our old episodes, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. This podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier. Stay well and look after each other. We'll see you next time.